If I had a nickel for every time I've covered a Class 1 railroad trying to get to Mexico, I'd have, what, 3 nickels? Which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it's happened thrice. Hello everybody, welcome back to Michael's Railroads and Comment, and today we will be covering the Union Pacific-Norfolk Southern Canadian National Merger Settlement Agreement. On July 22nd, the three railroads announced that Canadian National would drop its opposition to the Union Pacific-Norfolk Southern merger in exchange for various concessions in the Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri area, including access to Kansas City should the merger be approved. Additionally, UP and CN announced a trackage rights swap that would give UP a better route around the Chicago area and CN access to the Mexican border, regardless of what happens with the UP-NS merger. This is pretty big news, so let's jump right into it. Let's start by discussing what is going to happen regardless if UP-NS is approved or not. First, UP will be getting trackage rights on CN's Elgin, Julia, and Eastern. The J acts as a bypass around Chicago's heavily congested core, enabling traffic to flow quicker in all directions. UP plans on using the J to facilitate better connections with CSX and NS. Initially, UP plans on sending just 3 trains down the J, which, according to CN, is well within the line's capacity. However, should traffic increase, UP will have to pay for any resultant capacity improvements. UP almost bought the J back in the mid-1990s, however, they were preoccupied with the Chicago Northwestern and Southern Pacific mergers, and the Little Line ended up being bought by CN in 2009 in a very controversial merger, primarily because the Chicagoland communities did not want the increased train traffic the merger would bring. So we'll definitely keep an eye out to see if, they have trouble with this. Second, CN will be getting haulage rights off the ex-Illinois Central at Memphis, along the ex-Rock Island, Cotton Belt, Southern Pacific, and Missouri Pacific lines down to the Mexican border at Eagle Pass, Texas. If you're wondering why 2 parallel lines are shown, UP runs trains northbound on one line and southbound on the other in a directional running agreement. There are limitations on these rights, as CN will only be able to solicit traffic moving between Mexico and Canada, and not between Mexico and the United States, within the United States, or between the United States and Canada. Additionally, the only railroad that CN will be allowed to interchange with is Ferromex, which is Mexico's largest railroad, at Eagle Pass. To start off, these will be haulage rights, where CN will market the traffic, but UP will run the trains. Should traffic increase to sufficient levels, CN will convert these to trackage rights, where CN would start running the trains themselves. However, these rights are overhead, meaning CN can't directly serve customers along these lines. CN's interest in Mexico is relatively recent. They initially tried to gain access back in 2022 by outbidding Canadian Pacific for Kansas City Southern. However, as we all know, they lost out on KCS, mostly due to regulatory uncertainty. Since then, it's been speculated that CN would try and find a different way to the border, and well, here we are. These rights also open up the possibility of CN getting a Mexican concession, since the Mexican government has become increasingly concerned about the monopolistic nature of the railroad industry there. Maybe at some point in the future they'll allow CN in. I swear, like a leitmotif of my time covering this stuff is just railroads trying to get to Mexico. Not that I mind though, it's interesting stuff to talk about. Now moving on to what might happen if UP-NS is approved. First, CN will gain access to shippers who would otherwise see service reduced from 3 to 2 or from 2 to 1 by UP-NS merger. Said shippers are all pretty much in the Iowa and Illinois area. UP would also grant some shippers access to BNSF or CSX in place of CN due to just proximity. Second, CN will acquire NS's interest in the Terminal Railroad Association of St. Louis and the Kansas City Terminal Railway, neutral switching and terminal railroads jointly owned by their Class 1 connections. This ensures UP-NS would not have majority ownership post-merger, a thing that has been rather controversial. Third, CN will acquire overhead trackage rights on the ex-Chicago and Eastern Illinois between East St. Louis and Tuscola, Illinois, providing CN with a more direct route to Chicago compared with the current one via Springfield, Illinois. Fourth, CN will acquire haulage rights over the ex-Mopac between St. Louis and Kansas City. Just like the Mexican border rights, these can be converted to trackage rights if the traffic warrants. However, CN would actually be allowed to serve customers here. In fact, the agreement goes one step further, giving CN the option to buy the line and the sizable Neff yard in Kansas City proper along with it. This isn't too surprising, as this is where UP and NS have the most direct overlap. It was always assumed that UP-NS would have to give access to Kansas City to another railroad, up to and including line divestiture. CN's interest in Kansas City is also not surprising, as back during the CPR-KCS merger hearings, they tried to force a sale of the Gateway Western line, which, needless to say, wasn't successful. If you want more information, go watch the video I made at the time. It is a bit of an older one, and it's not as good as this one, but hey, it's still up there if you want to see. And fifth, and perhaps most importantly, in exchange for all of this, CN will drop its opposition to the UP-NS merger. So what does all of this mean? Well, it's a few less things for UP-NS to worry about as we get further into the review process, which can only bode well for the likelihood of the merger getting approved. It's also definitely not good for CPKC, since it looks like their rival will be getting access to major markets they serve. CPKC will still have the overall advantage owing to their Mexican concession, but CN will arguably have better routes to both Kansas City and the border. MOPAC is double-tracked, and CN's mostly flat border routes simply won't have to deal with the same kind of operational headaches CPKC has along the XKCS and the Ozarks. I also think we might see UP-NS strike more of these agreements. During the UP Q2 earnings call, CEO Jim Vena hinted at the possibility of one with CSX.
What is it that you give? Do you give access to somebody around Nashville? Well, we'd like access to Florida farther south to Jacksonville. At the end of the day, it's going to be difficult, but we're always open to have discussions.
Both Nashville and most of Florida have been under a rail monopoly by CSX and its predecessors for almost 50 years now. So an agreement where CSX grants access to those markets in exchange for some other concession would be huge. If I were CSX, I would try and get something that would be useful in a subsequent merger, such as the Kankakee Belt, another Chicago bypass line that ties nicely into both CSX and BNSF. Speaking of BNSF, they put out a statement denouncing the agreement, saying it further undermines UP-NS, as it shows railroads can cooperate to grow traffic rather than merging. At the time of me writing this, CPKC hasn't put out a statement, but their earnings call is tomorrow, so maybe they already have by the time this video is out. Lastly, on July 27th, UP-NS provided additional information that was requested from them on a variety of subjects, including expanding the committed gateway pricing program and providing additional shipper protections in case of merger-induced meltdowns. See my last video and the linked STB document below for more detail. Actually, let's touch on committed gateway pricing for a moment. This would allow BNSF and CSX to quote rates for carload traffic to and from specific portions of the merged UP-NS network. Previously, the only shippers eligible for this program were those exclusively served by either BNSF, CSX, UP-NS, or connecting shortline railroad. This new proposal removes the restriction that shippers be exclusively served by BNSF or CSX. Also, bulk unit train traffic, such as coal, grain, rock, etc., is now eligible. BNSF CEO Katie Farmer, in a statement released on July 28th, stated that the expansion of committed gateway pricing doesn't change anything. Only 1% of shippers would be eligible under BNSF's numbers, and she rightly points out that the program is temporary. It would end after just 5 years unless otherwise ordered. This isn't a long-term competitive solution. Reading between the lines, I think UP-NS are banking on a BNSF-CSX counter-merger, which is the logical outcome. Reading the downstream effects part of the new filing, one certainly gets that impression. But to me, committed gateway pricing as proposed seems like a stopgap until BNSF-CSX happens. And if it does stay long-term, well, UP-NS suggests that CSX-BNSF implement their own version, which, wouldn't actually be that bad of a thing. Anyways, this new filing means that we can now move into the public comment phase, now that all the information is hopefully presented. I actually would have liked to cover the filing more, but I only have limited bandwidth, and honestly, the Canadian National Agreement was just far more interesting to me. I gotta keep covering Mexico. I've never been to the place, but I gotta keep talking about it. I guess I need to go railfan in Mexico now. Who knows? Anyways, thank you to my good friend Jeep Studios for giving me the voice of Jim Vena, and thank all of you for watching. So, what do you think? Will CN be successful in challenging CPKC for Mid-America Mexico dominance? Will these concessions be enough to get the UP-NS merger through? Please comment your thoughts below. I'll see y'all in the next one. Goodbye, everybody.